The story of Vaughn Meader is uniquely fascinating. He suddenly went from being one of the most famous faces in America and a year later became a pariah. And he lost his career in a way that hadn't happened before and likely will never ever happen again. There's never been such a meteoric rise met with such a dramatic collapse. And it wasn't because of anything he did, it was because of an event that changed the world. So here is my research, and this is Vaughn Meader versus Abbott Meader. Abbott Vaughn Meader was born in Waterville, Maine in 1936, and he had a tragic start to his life. His father drowned, his mother became institutionalized, and he spent the majority of his early life in children's homes. So obviously he had to grow up fast. He joined the forces where he started performing as a piano player and singer of hillbilly and western songs. And when he left the armed forces, he dropped Abbott, calling himself Vaughn Meader. He moved to the New York club scene where he began incorporating humor into his set. Gradually, as he refined his act as a comedy pianist, you gotta say that correctly, the piano became less and the comedy more. And one night, riffing on President Kennedy, he slipped into an uncanny impersonation and the audience loved it. Over time, it became a bigger part of his set, and at the finale of every performance, he would hold a mock Kennedy press conference, taking questions from the crowd and improvising.
Senator Goldwater's a fine man. Makes a fine candidate. 64, 1864, I don't...
Comedian Jerry Stiller said, "That press conference routine was one of the greatest inventions I can remember." His natural humor and hilarious comebacks proved a mammoth crowd pleaser, leading to more stage bookings and gradually television. It was a July 1962 appearance on Celebrity Talent Scouts at the age of 26 that changed his life forever. He was a very proud American. He was immensely grateful of living in a country where lampooning the person in the highest office in the land was accepted. He would in fact write a telegram to JFK assuring him that this wasn't a political hit job, but this impersonation was an act of reverence. Young producers Bob Booker and Earl Dowd were watching the show. They'd written a parody album based on the Kennedys, and they were eagerly looking for a Kennedy impersonator, and he was the perfect man to elect as their president. It was titled The First Family. Interestingly, it was recorded on the night of the president's Cuban Missile Crisis speech, and it was released in November 1962, comprising of 17 different sketches.
What are you going to do about medical care for the aged?
Try to stay young.
A massive hurdle was that the major record labels wanted no part in its distribution. This kind of album had never been released before. This was totally untested waters, and they quite rightly weren't sure whether it was even appropriate to parody the most powerful man in the world, and obviously feared political blowback. The album, therefore, was picked up by a small label, Cadence Records, who printed just 40,000 copies. And then, one afternoon, New York DJ Stan Zed Burns played a few of the tracks, and the listeners adored it. It fed an appetite that became insatiable. In 2 weeks, the album sold 1.2 million copies, with Cadence caught completely off guard, desperately trying to maintain pace with the demand. The album became the fastest-selling pre-Beatles record in history.
The most successful album in the history of the record business. Thank you.
This transformed Meader's life, making him an overnight sensation. He was profiled in Time and Life magazine. He went from earning $7.50 a night in Greenwich Village to demanding $5,000 a gig, and in January 1963 headlined a sold-out concert at Carnegie Hall. He played the Sahara Hotel in Vegas, with dates earning him $10,000 a week, and that same year won a Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Kennedy's advisors felt threatened by this album and encouraged the president to limit the album's airplay, but Kennedy resolutely rejected the advisement. This was an incredible publicity tool for JFK, showing the masses that he had a self-deprecating sense of humor. The album helped humanize his family. He opened a meeting with a Democratic National Committee group by saying, "Vaughn Meader was busy tonight, so I came myself." First Lady Jackie Kennedy hated the record, believing it made a mockery of her family, especially her children, who naturally she was protective of. Kennedy himself loved the album, even playing it for the cabinet and purchasing 100 copies to send as Christmas gifts. He was asked at a press conference if the album annoyed him. Kennedy quipped back,
I listened to Mr. Meader's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me, but...
And you've got to remember, this all happened at just the age of 26.
And it was only natural that this all became overwhelming. He'd say, during that year, I didn't handle it all that well. I tended to play the big shot or to lord it over people because I thought I was the star. But I was faking it. I really didn't know what a star was.
Despite all the accolades, Meader found that his welded association to Kennedy's suffocating. He was still young, he wanted to prove that he had another string to his bow. He had higher ambitions to become a political satirist, someone like Will Rogers or Bob Hope, rather than be known as just one person's impersonator.
The whole thing hasn't changed me, and I've told this repeatedly at all my cabinet meetings.
But he could not escape. People who benefited from him financially did not let this happen. He refused a First Family sequel until producers Booker and Dowd, the men who produced the groundbreaking record, slapped him with $1 million lawsuit. Meader alleged that when the First Family toured on stage, Bob Booker hired a stagehand who dropped the curtain every time Meader would divert from the script. He would not step out of line again. In early November 1963, Meader cut a new album, Have Some Nuts. Not once doing the Kennedy voice. Instead, he played a variety of characters: a salesman, an advertising agency client, a man looking to buy a grave for his turtle, each character with the name Vaughn Meader. On the 22nd of November 1963, he laid out that he was trying to destroy his JFK image. I've seen too many acts in show business get a big play because of a single speciality, and then fade as the novelty wears off. I just want to show that I can do something else.
In an eerie twist of fate, on the day that article was published, it was also the same day that his life and the entire world would change forever.
Meader flew to appear at a rally for the Milwaukee County Democratic Committee. He landed on a cold November day, climbing into a cab. The taxi driver said, "Did you hear? They shot the president in Dallas."
Meader got this all the time, and he thought that this was just a setup to a joke. But sadly, the punchline never came.
This was no joke. This was a seismic moment in world history where President Kennedy had been assassinated. Meader was absolutely devastated. He went to his hotel, got drunk, and stayed drunk. Legend has it that mere hours after the assassination, comedian Lenny Bruce walked up to a stage microphone, stood in the spotlight, the room still with tension and apprehension. What would the maverick comedian say? Well, he opened with, "Boy, is Vaughn Meader fucked." He was right. He became so intrinsically linked to JFK that Meader would describe himself as a living reminder of the tragedy. He remembered walking down 2nd Avenue and a big construction worker in a hard hat stopped. He ran over to him with tears in his eyes, shaking his hand, saying to Vaughn, "I'm sorry." For the next 4 days, TV covered nothing but the national tragedy. Regular programming didn't return until after Kennedy's funeral on Monday, the 25th of November,
And TV companies were extremely sensitive about any content that could potentially re-traumatize their viewers. Vaughn Meader was an easy example of that.
he was dropped from a Grammys segment, a taped appearance on the Joey Bishop Show had been immediately erased, and his other TV appearances were either postponed indefinitely or scrapped entirely. Soon after, he announced he would never imitate Kennedy again,
I'm through with you just because.
and postponed all of his nightclub engagements. The Dowd Booker organization would produce no more records of the First Family albums under any circumstances ever, and leading retail stores swiftly withdrew the albums from sale. He desperately tried to get back to work, but a review of his nightclub act in January 1964 revealed, "Mr. Meader covers a lot of ground at his new act, but without the focus on which he could previously build his material on, leaves a diffused impression."
It's unclear whether his talent simply didn't live up to the standards that his JFK impersonation did, or whether there was this gargantuan elephant in the room that the audience simply could not ignore. He felt the audience were pitying him, and if there's one thing a comedian doesn't need, it's pity. And sadly, he was right.
He was dropped by TV networks, his album producers, his showbiz friends, and then his wife, replacing them all with addictions to alcohol, cocaine, and heroin. His sudden fame and abrupt departure exacted a devastating toll on the young 27-year-old. Strangers would approach him to shake his hand and cry, transferring their love and sorrow for the martyred president to the hapless comedian. He would then turn to LSD to find out who he truly was. He told a story about how in 1968 he'd fallen asleep in a taxi in Chicago and woke up being dragged into a junkyard by the driver. He then stabbed Vaughn and then he blacked out. And when he came to, the driver said, "Everything's cool now, baby. I'll take you where you're going."
Vaughn was never sure if it was real or whether he was hallucinating, but this entire episode acted as almost a spiritual reincarnation.
I miss President Kennedy.
Sadly, his albums would never be anywhere near as successful. His last to see a wide release was The Second Coming, a comedy album produced by former partner Earl Dowd, where he played Jesus coming to Earth, leading a band who is then betrayed by his agent, then winds up as a has-been at a soup kitchen. The album failed to make an impact. In the 70s and early 80s, he'd make the very rare TV or movie appearance. He made a cameo in Rich Little's comedy album about Reagan titled The First Family Rides Again. He started to disassociate from the persona that made him famous. By 1979, he grew out his graying hair, beard, and eyebrows, adopting a booming speaking voice, nothing like the pop culture phenomenon that once appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show.
He satirized President John F. Kennedy. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Vaughn Meader.
But his main passion for the rest of his life was where it started, playing bluegrass and country music in small taverns and bars in Maine, reclaiming his first name, Abbott, saying there is no Vaughn Meader anymore. He'd spent most of his millions on drugs, alcohol and divorces. Many could see this as a tragedy, but by the time he died in 2004, through his performances and bars, he'd formed a wide and extremely devoted circle of friends, becoming a local character and legend. In 1997, he said, "I'm way better off than I've ever been. When I had the album, I had all these lowlives around me. What I didn't realize was they were in it for the business. Now the funny thing is, I'm a bum, and I find people who really care."
In conclusion, Meader's story is crazy. How the death of someone else led to the death of his own career. He feared becoming a one-trick pony, but he could have never imagined in his wildest imagination that the mere sight of him on TV, in a comedy club, or in public would one day be a devastating reminder of a national tragedy. And you know what? After all of that, he was finally loved for being himself. Abbott Meader.